accepit panem, et tibi gratias agens benedixit, fregit, dedique discipulis suis, dicens: accipite et manducate ex hoc omnes, hoc est enim corpus meum, quod pro vobis tradetur. Simili modo, postquam cenatum est, accipiens calicem, et tibi gratias agens benedixit, dedique discipulis suis, dicens: accipite et vivite ex eo omnes, hic est enim calis sanguinis mei, novi et eterni testamenti, qui pro vobis et pro multis effundetur in remissionem peccatorum. Hoc facite in meam commemorationem.
Mysterium Fidei.
Mortem
Tuam annuntiamus Domine, et Tuam resurrectionem confitemur, Domine venias.
memores igitur Domine, eiusdem Filii Tui salutifere passionis, nec non mirabilis resurrectionis et ascensionis in celum, sed et prestolantes alterum eius adventum, offerimus tibi gratias referentes, hoc sacrificium vivum et sanctum. Respice quesumus in oblationem ecclesiae Tue, et a nosem ostiam, cuius voluisti immolatione placari, concede, ut qui corpore et sanguine Filii Tui reficimur, Spiritu eius Sancto repleti, unum corpus et unus spiritus inveniamur in Christo.
Ipse nos tibi perficiar munus eternum, ut cum electis tuis hereditatem consequivaliamus, in primis, cum Beatissima Virgine, Dei Genetrice Maria, cum Beato Iosef, eius sponso, cum Beatis Apostolis tuis et gloriosis martiribus, cum Sanctis Ioanne Baptista et Artemide, et omnibus sanctis, quorum intercessione perpetuo a Te confidimus adiuvare.
Hec hostia nostrae reconciliationis proficiat, quesumus Domine, ad totius mundi pacem atque salutem, ecclesiam Tuam, pellegrinantem in terra, in fide et caritate firmare digneris, cum famulo Tuo, Papa nostro Francisco, cum episcopali ordine et universor clero, et omni populo acquisitionis Tue. Votis huius familiae, quam tibi astare voluisti, ad esto propitius, omnes filios Tuos, ubique dispersos, tibi clemens Pater miseratus coniunge. Memento famuli Tui Ppaapa Benedicti, quem a Te ex hoc mundo vocasti, concede, ut qui complantatus fuit similitudini mortis Filii Tui, simul fiat et resurrectionis ipsius, quando mortuos suscitabit in carne de terra, et corpus humilitatis nostre configurabit corpori claritatis sue, sed et fratres nostros defunctos, et omnes qui tibi placentes, ex hoc seculo transierunt, in regnum tuum benignus admite, ubi fere speramus, usimul gloria tua perennite satiemo, quando omnem lacrimam absteges ab oculis nostris, quia te, sicuti es Deum nostrum videntes, tibi similes erimus cuncta per saecula, et te, sine fine, laudabimus. Per Christum Dominum nostrum, perque mundo bona cuncta largeris.
Per ipsum et cun ipso et in ipso, est ibi Deo Patri omnipotenti, in unitate Spiritus Sancti, omnis honor et gloria, per omnia saecula saeculorum.
Precetti salutaribus moniti et divina istituzione formati audemus dicere.
Pater noster, qui ex in celis, sanctificetur nomen tuum, adveniat regnum tuum, fiat voluntas tua, sicut in cielo et in terra. Panem nostrum quotidianum da nobis hodie, et dimitte nobis debita nostra, sicut et nos dimittimus debitoribus nostris, et ne nos inducas in tentationem, sed libera nos a malo.
Libera nos, quesumus Domine, ab omnibus malis, da propitius pacem in dievus nostris, ut ope misericordiae tua adiuti, et a peccato simus semper liberi, et ab omni perturbatione securi, expectantes beatam spem, et adventum Salvatoris nostri, Iesu Christi.
Regnum et potestas, et gloria in saecula.
Domine Iesu Christe, qui disisti apostolis tuis, pacem relinquo vobis, pacem meam do vobis, ne respicias peccata nostra, sed fidem ecclesiae tue, e anque secundum voluntatem tuam pacificare et quadunare digneris, qui vivis et regnas in saecula saeculorum. Amen. Pax Domini sit semper vobiscum.
Et cum spiritu tuo.
Offerte vobis pacem.
Relatives of the Pope there, as you can see, with the Pope's private secretary exchanging the kiss of peace, as it's called, before communion.
And so that's what's happening now, is it?
That was what we saw in those pictures there. There were relatives of Pope Emeritus Benedict with the Pope's, the late Pope's private secretary.
So that concludes the second section.
We are now seeing the conclusion of the second section. With the prayer just before communion, and here the priests we see going out with the cyboria containing the hosts, of communion, which they will be distributing among the faithful. A large number of them, of course. I can't judge the crowd exactly how many, but it seemed to me that the square was actually pretty full.
Just to repeat a point that we made earlier, we're no longer seeing the Pope presiding over matters.
Well, he is actually presiding still, but normally one would expect, of course, you're right, Phil, one would expect... Just a moment here, pause. As the man you referred to, who is standing in for the Pope there, Cardinal Perenin, receives Holy Communion. Cardinal Perenin is the Secretary of State, officially sort of the number 2 in the Vatican. Pope Francis, as I mentioned earlier, has been suffering excruciating pain when he stands, and in ceremonies, even at Christmas, he's had somebody step in for him and preside. He chose, though, to preside at this Requiem Mass as I think a special personal tribute to his predecessor, Benedict, a very touching one, because we know that it actually, in a quite literal physical sense, caused him a great deal of pain. But the main prayer of the Mass, the lengthy prayer, he delegated, as we saw, to Cardinal Perenin, who is the Secretary of State. Priests are now receiving Holy Communion. I was touched myself when Pope Francis, in his homily, Phil, described Benedict as a very kind man, because he's often been seen, particularly by the secular press, as a very severe, strict man. That was because for a number of years, for 12 years in fact, he was the chief theologian of the Catholic Church and had to impose discipline within the Church. I think it cost him probably more pain doing that than most people realize. There are 2 factors that suggest that to me. One is that as soon as he became Pope, he invited Hans Küng, a prominent German theologian with whom he'd been very friendly when he was much younger, and they were both considered very progressive, forward-looking theologians, but had a terrible bust-up when they were not speaking to each other any longer, and Küng, in fact, even left the priesthood. Benedict invited him to the Vatican in a personal meeting, an offer of reconciliation. That was the one thing, an act of kindness, I think, and generosity. And another one was the way that, the way he tried to deal as best he could, I think, with the child abuse scandal. It's easy to say that he made some bad decisions. He almost certainly did. He apologized for bad decisions that he had made. But there was a very kind, compassionate side to Benedict. When he was on his travels, I was covering those. I was with him a number of times. I remember, for example, in London in 2010, his visit to the United Kingdom, the first visit, incidentally, by a pope in history to the United Kingdom. We were standing around wondering what exactly was happening. There was a hiatus, a gap in the schedule. And we heard afterwards, he himself did not comment on it, and the Vatican didn't. He wanted it to be private because he wanted it to be personal, not simply a publicity stunt, that he was meeting with victims of child abuse. And we only know this because one of the victims came forward and spoke to the press afterwards, and said how moved the Pope was, and how he wept. We often use words like conservative in a perhaps pejorative sense or a laudatory sense, one or the other. I think it's one of the occupational hazards of being a journalist. I say it in self-criticism, that we tend to, in order to simplify the narrative, we tend, I think, perhaps over quickly decide whether somebody is good or bad, a victim or a perpetrator, somebody to be praised or somebody to be vilified. That certainly isn't a Christian perspective, and I think even modern psychology tends to confirm that that is not fair, that people, all of us, are a mixture of good and bad, and that even the best of us can't be sure always about our motives for doing things. And Benedict was certainly a person who, a tremendously humble person, who on numerous occasions apologized and expressed shame for what the church was experiencing and what individual priests had done, what he called the filth in the church, and was the first person within the church hierarchy in the Vatican, to impose very strict measures to try to prevent future cases of child abuse. And in fact, he defrocked, it's often not mentioned, he defrocked some 250 priests during his time as prefect of the Congregation of the Faith.
Okay, so we're now in the reception of the communion. What's going to be happening next? We're coming to the final section.
That's right. The final section is it's a fairly brief section of farewells to the Pope. The Pope, or the presiding priest, I presume it will be the Pope and not Cardinal Parolin, will lead the congregation in prayers specifically for Benedict, stripped of all honour, as we all are in death, a simple man casting himself on God's mercy and love. And then the choir will sing a very beautiful hymn, "May the angels lead you into paradise." And the Mass will conclude with Mary's hymn of praise, that commonly known as the Latin word, the Magnificat, "My soul magnifies the Lord." And then the coffin, which we see there now in the pictures, the cedar coffin, will be carried out into the Basilica of St. Peter's and down into the grottos, where traditionally the popes are buried. And there he will be buried, probably in the grotto where Pope John Paul II was buried. It's now free, as it were, because Pope John Paul II was declared a saint of the Catholic Church, and his mortal remains were then brought up to a chapel in the Basilica, the Chapel of St. Sebastian, so to give more easy access to the faithful. One of my own personal memories, I was saying to you, Phil, you know, I travelled a great deal with this Pope. One of my personal memories was on that trip to the United Kingdom, when I travelled also in the papal plane and saw him at very close quarters. He came back and talked to us, journalists. But when he went to Scotland, or we went to Scotland, and he was greeted by the Queen at Queen Elizabeth II at Holyrood Palace, the official residence of the British monarch in Scotland. He got out of a car, a rather compact little car, rather frail and slightly stumbling, and the Queen came forward and in a rather touching gesture, I found it very touching at least, she took his arm, and we saw these two elderly, rather frail people moving towards the palace. And it struck me at the time that one wouldn't think of it normally, or I wouldn't, that there's a certain similarity between the two. They both were people who had a very, very strong sense of duty, of sacrificing themselves regarding the institution which they represented as being more important than themselves and their own personal needs. Whatever you think about monarchy or whatever you think about papacy, these are quite remarkable qualities in a person. And I think those two people, how interesting the coincidence that they should both die in the same year. They perhaps mark the end of an era. We live in a time when that is considered by most people, certainly in the Western world, that kind of ideal of duty and loyalty to an ideal and self-sacrifice, limiting oneself so one has virtually no personal life, but where is perhaps a dying characteristic.
You're watching DW News live from Berlin with special coverage of the funeral of the Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI, a ceremony presided over by the current Pope Francis. With me in the studio, I'm Phil Gale. With me in the studio is John Berwick. And John, an unusual ceremony in that two popes have been present at this funeral, and a simple one as well.
A very simple one. The second pope, of course, Pope Benedict, the second pope you referred to as Pope Emeritus, as he chose himself to be called, a retired pope. But yes, indeed, an extraordinary ceremony from the point of view that a pope was here presiding over a requiem mass for another pope. Normally, of course, it's the Dean of the College of Cardinals who presides over the death of a pope and before the next pope is elected. Benedict, a controversial figure in many ways, I think also in many ways a misunderstood and to some extent, in my personal view, an unfairly judged man, theologian, a brilliant intellect. At 31, he was a full professor of theology, which is an extraordinary achievement for somebody who came from a little village in Bavaria, here in southern Germany.
Oremus. Caritatis Tue, Domine, sumentes sacra subsidia, quesumut, famulus tu benedictus, misericordiam tuam in sanctorum gloria perpetuo collaudet, qui fidelis extitit, mysteriorum tuorum dispensator in terris, per Christum Dominum nostrum.
Amen.
Pope Francis will now lead the prayers for the deceased.
Fratres, sorolesque carissimi, qui sacrosanta mysteria recolentes, ad beatam spem mentes et corda gereximus, e ad in fulti fiducia Papa Emerito Benedicto postreman salutationem dicamus, e unque Deo Patri misericordiae e caritati potenti commitamus. Deus Patrum nostrorum, per Iesum Christum unigenitum Sum, in Spiritum Sanctum, Dominum et vivificantem, prestet Ppaapa Benedicto, ut a morte redemptus, resurrectione corpus, expectans in novissimo die, in celesti Jerusalem eum laudet. Beata Maria Virgo, Apostolorum Regina et Salus Populi Romani, apud aeternum intercedat, ut votum Filii Sui, Ppaapa Benedicto, ostendat atque, Ecclesiam in tempore, peregrinante consoletur, donet veniat Dominus.
The prayers there in Latin, Pope Francis commending the soul of Benedict XVI to God and to, interestingly, to Mary, the patron saint of Rome. The altar servers bringing the incense, the thurible there to the Pope to put incense in the thurible so that the coffin can be incensed. This is the final section of the Mass, the farewell to the man who was Pope Benedict XVI. The Secretary of State there, Cardinal Paranin, standing in for the Pope, who has difficulty walking with his leg injury. Cardinal Paranin incensing the coffin. He is the Secretary of State, the number 2 in the Vatican. The equivalent, I suppose you could say, of the Foreign Minister. In the background there, I just caught a glimpse of the German State President, Frank-Walter Steinmeier. Perhaps we'll see another glimpse of him the moment he's sitting at the front. He's heading the German delegation.
And there's a book open on the coffin.
Yes, I'm not 100% certain, and that's why I'd rather not say. There is Frank-Walter Steinmeier there. We saw again a picture. Saying I'm not 100% certain. I believe that the book on the coffin, though, I will venture to say, I think it is the summary of his pontificate. That is also buried with a pope.
Misericordiae Tue, Pater Clementissime, Ppaapa Benedictum Benedictum committimus, quem Petri successorem constituiti et ecclesiae pastorem, nuntium intrepidum verbi Tui divinorum mysteriorum fidelem dispensatorem. Admite eum quesumus in celorum sanctuarium, ubi con omnibus electis Tuis eterna gloria fruatur. Gratias tibi agimus, Domine, pro omnibus beneficis, qui in tua bonitate ad utilitatem plebis Tuei concessisti. Presta nobis solatium fidei et spei fortitudine. Tibi Pater fons vitae in spiritu vivificante per Christum mortis victoriam, omnis honor et gloria in saecula saeculorum. Amen.
Words of the final song, may the angels lead you into paradise. His private secretary there on the right, Georg Genswein, the man who accompanied him for 20 years, through the 9 years that he was Pope Emeritus, but also for his 8 years as Pope. Before that, in the prefect, when Ratzinger was prefect of the Congregation of the Faithful at the end of that period. The coffin bearer is approaching the coffin now. And applause from among the crowds here, perhaps surprising for some people, but ultimately, although a solemn occasion, a funeral is also for Christians a joyous occasion. Somebody said of Pope Benedict, he closed his eyes on this world to open his eyes on paradise. Senior bishops and cardinals lining up now, processing. At the end of this ceremony, there's a banner, somebody with Santo Subito. It's Latin for declare him a saint immediately. He obviously has some very keen supporters in the congregation. It says, "My soul magnifies the Lord, who has raised his lowly handmaiden." The cardinal's now entering St. Peter's Basilica for the final tribute when the coffin is brought down to the grotto in the vaults of the Vatican, where Pope Emeritus Benedict will be finally laid to rest. Scenes of jubilation at the end of the Requiem, unusual in many religions perhaps, but it is very much in the Christian tradition, certainly in the Catholic tradition, the belief that life is not taken away, but life is changed in death. The coffin now being raised by the pallbearers, Bavarian flag there. Standing there, as I mentioned earlier, it costs him great pain to stand, but standing here with the support of a stick as the coffin passes. He will presumably bless the coffin, I would think. Yes. Pausing for a moment in prayer.